fish rots from the head, and that putting a man like Boris Johnson in charge of the party did set an example of, the rules don't apply to you.
Marcus, have you ever called an elderly work colleague at 3:15 a.m. demanding £5,000 because you've been locked up by bad people?
I'm just trying to think, because I wondered if this would come up. I mean, obviously, I've called elderly people in the night demanding money, but never under those circumstances.
Well, quite. It's very precise, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's always been precise. And it was nearly always my younger brother. So, and it's sort of fine, you know, and it was sort of 20 quid. So,
but this is the story of Mark Menzies, the Conservative MP for Fylde, and a government trade envoy, or at least he was, who stands accused of doing exactly that. He is supposed to have phoned up a 78-year-old member of his local party, asking for £5,000 because he was being held by bad people. Very mysterious phrase. He's also accused of using money from donors, £14,000 for his own purposes, he says, for medical expenses, although that's unclear. And in the past, he has been questioned by police over accusations that he got a dog drunk, which he denies. And there's also gossip in his constituency about a drunken incident at a Catherine Jenkins concert. And he previously resigned over allegations that he'd paid a male teenage escort for sex and drugs. Gosh, he sounds like fun. Alys, why does this all feel so very Tory?
I mean, there is something kind of end of days about this scandal. It obviously comes off the back of Will Ragg being entrapped. I think so. The problem is, I also have never called a work colleague late at night, but I have worked for an MP.
Yeah.
And I
does that mean one's called you? Have you had to turn up at mysterious flats in the middle of the night with £5,000?
The thing is, I was very fortunate to have a wonderful boss who was a great mentor, but not all MPs are like that. And I think what this story really reveals is the kind of culture of impunity that exists in the House of Commons, the complete lack of protection there is for people who work for MPs, and what a bizarre workplace it is. I mean, there is now a kind of independence grievance scheme for people who work for MPs, but previously, if you had a problem with a boss, if they were harassing you or bullying you or making inappropriate demands on you, you'd have to talk to the whips.
Yeah.
And of course, the whip's job is to protect the party. So I think this really exposes a sort of dangerous culture of impunity that we have in the House of Commons. You have people who become MPs who are very attracted to power and to risk, and very little to stop them behaving in this way.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, Marcus, there's the old cliche about politics being showbiz for ugly people. But as somebody in showbiz, you lot don't get to act like this. It's much more dull.
I was going to say that my wing of showbiz, comedy, is also showbiz for ugly people. So, No, I mean, we don't, and in the end, you have to hope that most MPs don't. I mean, this story has landed at a tremendous time for Boris Johnson, who's also been found this week to have broken the rules, having, I think, taken hedge fund money from someone for a trip of influence, allegedly, and not declared it, and all of that kind of stuff. I mean, he must be absolutely thrilled that this story is out there and once again cast him into the shadows. But I do think it's worth just remembering that he is the man out in front with the great big flag when it comes to these sorts of standards in politics, going downhill.
Except it does feel very, emotionally, it feels there's very sort of a very flashback to the 1990s feel here, right? Sort of back to basics, exhausted bunch of weirdos.
The end of the major
sort of
government.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's I mean, Alys, something that sort of strikes me as also remarkable about this story is the fact that he's been being investigated about this for months by the party, and only leaked out thanks to Billy Kember, a reporter on the Times. What can the party have been thinking, just sort of vaguely hoping this would all go away?
Yeah, I think you see this again and again, that complaints get sort of swept under the carpet or ignored. I think there's clearly a sort of problem of governance. I think it is fair to say that you do get, as you describe them, weirdos in every party. But it does feel like something is kind of rotting in the Conservative Party. And I think Marcus does have a point that that a fish rots from the head, and that putting a man like Boris Johnson in charge of the party did set an example of, the rules don't apply to you.
Yeah. Well, except, again, this particular MP, he was, he was first, he resigned in 2014 from his job. And I presumably those allegations went nowhere because he was still in his job 10 years later. But
he was a Cameron A-lister, wasn't he?
Yeah.
Which is one of the odd things about it.
And The party volunteer who he called in the middle of the night, who I believe is 78 years old, complained about this some time ago and is absolutely livid and very sad. I mean, the story I read is that she'd been in floods of tears as she described how powerless she'd been left feeling about this. I must say, though, if Labour win the number of seats that they could potentially win based on today's polling,
Yeah.
if I were Keir Starmer, I would be sending out an extremely detailed form for people to fill in as to exactly how they spend their spare time, because there are going to be, as there was for Blair in '97, a lot of MPs potentially coming in who the leadership of the Labour Party don't really know.
Yeah. What?
So yes, I'd be sending out a tick box form. Have you, like when you go into the States and it says, "Are you a terrorist or are you planning to be one?" One of those, really exhaustive. So at least they can say, "Look, we asked whether they habitually make phone calls in the middle of the night demanding money from volunteers."
Well, sorry, Alice.
So yeah, I just think it's worth remembering that at the centre of the story, as Marcus said, is a 74-year-old woman who devoted her life to the Conservative Party. She regarded it as her family. These are the people that kind of oil the wheels of our democracy, the people who go out and deliver the leaflets and who really care about their communities. And these are the people that keep getting poorly treated by those in power.
Yeah, well, the sort of the Matthew Paris line on this, which he was talking about earlier this week, and I think his column is about today in the paper, is that there will always be a high proportion of people who want to be MPs, who want to be in government, who are going to be sort of dangerous risk takers, because the two urges are very similar. I will say, as the child of an MP, I've never really considered my father to be a dangerous risk taker. Chance would be a fine thing, but I can see how that I can see how that could indeed be a pattern. Anyway, look, I was asking whether this was just whether this was a flashback to the 90s, an exhausted bunch of conservative weirdos. And speaking of exhausted conservative weirdos, Liz Truss has a book out. 10 Years to Save the West does not appear to have any suggestions in it about how to save the West, but it does explain the various disasters that befell Liz Truss during her 49 days in power, and it explains that they were not her fault, but everybody else's fault. She's been publicising it with a series of interviews, including one on US TV where she held her book upside down. Presumably that wasn't her fault either. Alice, what do you feel we've learned this week?
Oh, very little.
Really?
I think what I find frustrating about the sort of Liz Truss parade, the Liz Truss circus, is that she's the worst possible advocate for her own ideas.
Right.
There is a lot to be said for changing the state, for reducing taxes, for breaking the kind of sclerotic hold that the cycle of low growth that Britain is in. There is a lot to be said for that, but she's clearly makes those ideas seem loony and unpopular, and that's what's frustrating.
But isn't that because there's always a lot to be said for making things better. Everyone's in favour of making things better. Isn't the problem with Liz Truss it's not just that her presentation is weird. It's that she went into office in that brief window of time when you were last on the show, and sort of thought, okay, what we do is we immediately blow up the world, and everything will be fine tomorrow. And presumably, if you do want a sort of lower tax, lower spending, high growth society, that's a project that takes more than a week.
Yeah,
right?
I think what she revealed in office, that it was actually quite bad at politics. I mean,
Yeah,
having been quite a successful
And
cabinet
governments,
minister, she didn't pace herself. She, as the Queen advised her to, she tried to do everything all at once without even apparently realising that this would have a terrible impact on the markets. And it seems like she just didn't. She was bad at politics, essentially.
Yeah, it was really, really odd. Marcus, one of Liz Truss's key complaints in the book is that there weren't enough experts on her side, as if in a more fair world, experts would be distributed evenly among people who think different things. I feel there's like a really deep truth there right at her fingertips that she's not quite getting, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what she's suggesting there is that the deep state and the civil service, who should have been her experts, were working against her. But the experts that she turned to are the theorists who exist in Tufton Street, the groups of sort of right-wing think tanks and all the rest of it, who I think got Liz Truss very excited. I mean, the reading I've done about Liz Truss is that she is a very excitable person. She'll go along with an idea with a lot of passion, and certainly her speeches seem to reflect that. And I think that the Tufton Street people who she surrounded herself with, and sort of always has, but particularly then, got her really excited and suggested this might work. And of course, if it had, and she turned around the fortunes of the UK, she'd be held in very high esteem. But I mean, it wasn't just experts. She writes in the book about how between her and her husband, they couldn't persuade Ocado to deliver to number 10 Downing Street. So I do have some sympathy with her feeling that from the get-go, things weren't working. I mean, if you're the Prime Minister and you can't even persuade Ocado to come to you, then there's a big problem.
There's a problem there. Alys, in that sort of that part of the broader political ecosystem, that because there were some people who were very excited when Liz Truss came in and said, "I'm going to do all this stuff. I'm going to cut this and cut that. I'm high growth society and blah blah blah." In that bit of the wider political ecosystem, how do people feel about Liz Truss now? Do people now think she let us down? Do they think she messed this up? Or do they think, you know what, maybe we got a bit carried away?
I think, full disclosure, I should say that I used to work in Tufton Street.
There is a reason why I've asked you this question. Yeah.
And I would also point out that the Institute of Economic Affairs, which I think is the think tank most associated with it, isn't in Tufton Street.
Except spiritually?
It's spiritually in Tufton Street.
Yeah.
I think I would say, how do people feel in those things? I think very disappointed, as I say, that she has discredited ideas around kind of rolling back some of the frontiers of the state, which people who work in those think tanks genuinely strongly believe is better for society, and not just because they're evil Tories, because they believe that growth and prosperity is good for everybody, for the poorest in society as well as the wealthiest. I think there's a lot of frustration among people who want to sort of seem mainstream and centrist, that she is kind of going around, standing next to people like Steve Bannon in America. And yeah, I think that so there is a sort of wing of the Conservative Party that is frustrated, but it's also fair to say another wing, the sort of popular Conservatives or new Conservatives, whoever, who's still thoroughly standing by her.
People say new Conservatives. I just hear new Conservatives. It's all wrong, but I do. But is there, Alys? Sorry, is there also a slight sort of mea culpa thing there on that? People who go, you know what, actually maybe this is harder than we thought it was. Maybe actually we need more than just somebody in power who agrees with our ideas, because actually there are whole systems there and you can't just ignore them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the thing is that think tanks would advocate individual policies, right? So there's a lot of policies that people like the IEA and the Centre for Policy Studies did want Liz Truss to do, but say, well, like, not all at once.
Yeah.
I think you
sure.
could easily say that a lot of the things she wanted to do are still a good idea.
Right.
Corporation tax, I think, probably is too high, but
you
do need to take the markets with you.
Every one of them at once while going to war with the Bank of England. Sorry, Marcus.
There's a pleasing story which I admit I've not read all of, but that Liz Truss's favourite historian, who she quotes very often, has said Liz Truss does not understand a word I write, and that what he wrote about Reaganite and US right-wing ideas. He then went on to explain how and why they'd failed, but she just goes on going, this book says this, and seems delighted with it. So I don't know. I mean, the deregulatory agenda, which is, I think, sewn really close to the heart of the Brexit project, the idea that if we get rid of regulation, we can see some success, economic success, and all the rest of it. There is some truth to it, apart from as soon as you deregulate, you fall further out of step with people who we trade with. And also, I would argue that, for example, the regulator who's supposed to oversee the water companies and oversee them spending enough money on infrastructure, particularly when you look at how much they've borrowed, or making sure that they don't flood the rivers and the seas with raw sewage on a regular basis. That doesn't work. And the deregulatory agenda is different across every industry. But as an example, I think that one's quite helpful. They literally fill things with poo.